Welcome to KOT Aero, knowledge on tap for the aerospace industry. Subscribe for free at kotaero.com. All right, let's dive into it.
Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today, we're going to try to make sense of Boeing's third quarter 2024 earnings.
Yeah.
And it's been a rough one.
It has been a very interesting quarter for them.
Yeah, so we're talking strikes, we're talking huge charges on some of their flagship projects, the 777X program,
Right.
a new CEO who's promising to completely change the culture at Boeing.
It's definitely a turning point, I think, for the company. It's this goes beyond just the numbers themselves.
Right.
It's about understanding the story behind those numbers and the challenges and the potential, I think, that exists for them to turn things around.
Absolutely. So let's just kind of dive right in here. The headline number that I think everyone's kind of fixated on is this $6.17 billion loss this quarter. And just for context, last year for the same period, they lost $1.64 billion.
Right.
So we're talking about a loss that's almost 4 times bigger than it was last year. So, I mean, how worried should we be? Is this a sign of deeper problems, or is this just kind of a temporary setback?
Well, and that's the question, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing that I think everyone's trying to wrap their head around. I think what's interesting here is that this isn't just the typical cyclical downturn that you might see with Boeing.
Okay.
You've got kind of a perfect storm of factors that are hitting them all at once.
So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, the economy's down, so of course Boeing is having a tough time.
Right.
There's a little more to it than that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for example, the IAM strike, the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, right? That wasn't just a minor inconvenience for Boeing. I mean, having those workers walk off the job, that had a ripple effect.
Yeah, because when the production lines stop, that means the revenue stops too, right?
It does. Every day that those workers were out on strike, that meant delayed deliveries, that meant disrupted supply chains.
Right.
And ultimately, it all flows down to their bottom line.
And then on top of that, you've got these massive charges that Boeing announced, right? So $3 billion on the 777X and 767 programs.
Right.
And then another $2 billion on top of that on these defense projects. The T-7A Red Hawk, the KC-46A Tanker.
Yeah.
I mean, it's financial whiplash. What is the deal with these charges?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you can kind of think about these charges almost like a company sending up a flare.
Okay.
Signaling that there's trouble ahead.
Yeah.
A lot of times what these charges represent are deeper issues with a particular project.
Okay.
So it could be things like schedules are slipping, costs are ballooning way beyond those initial estimates.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it even represents kind of fundamental technological hurdles that they're having trouble overcoming.
So it's not just that these projects are a little bit behind schedule.
Right.
It's that they're so far off track that it's setting off these alarm bells on the financial side.
Exactly. And you look at a program like the 777X, for example.
Right.
That program has been plagued by delays for years now.
Right.
And these charges suggest that those delays are even more costly than perhaps they initially thought.
Right.
And the same goes for some of those defense projects that you mentioned. The KC-46 Tanker in particular has faced a whole host of challenges.
Yeah.
And again, these charges indicate that those challenges are not going away anytime soon.
And this is all happening at a time when Boeing can least afford it.
Right.
And it leads us to their cash flow situation, which I have to say is giving me a little bit of anxiety just thinking about it.
Yeah.
They burned through $2 billion in free cash flow this quarter.
That's a great point. And that's something I think investors should be paying very close attention to.
Yeah.
You see, a company can weather a bad quarter or two profit-wise.
Right.
If they have a healthy cash cushion.
Okay.
But when you start talking about negative free cash flow, and especially at this magnitude, it means that Boeing is spending way more cash than it's actually bringing in.
So it's like they're hemorrhaging money.
Yeah.
And if they don't stop the bleeding.
Exactly.
Pretty.
And it's not even just the free cash flow. Their operating cash flow is also deep in the red, negative $1.3 billion.
Yeah.
So both of those figures together
Right.
really paint, I think, a worrisome picture of their financial flexibility moving forward.
So for those of us listening who don't necessarily speak fluent finance,
Right.
break it down for me. What does this actually mean
Right.
for Boeing in practical terms? Does this mean that they can't invest in new projects?
Yeah.
What happens if another crisis hits? I mean, how hamstrung are they?
That's right. I mean, essentially what a weak cash flow situation does is it ties Boeing's hands.
Okay.
They may be forced to make some really difficult choices, right? Delaying new projects, making significant cost cuts, potentially even taking on more debt, which of course has its own risks.
Yeah.
So it really limits their options and their flexibility
Okay.
in a time when they desperately need it.
So it sounds like Boeing is like walking this financial tightrope right now. Which begs the question, can they turn things around, or is this like the beginning of a downward spiral?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
There are a few bright spots in this report that I think offer some interesting insights.
Okay. I could use a little good news right now.
Yeah, well, let's look at global services, for example.
Okay.
This is the part of Boeing that provides maintenance, parts, support to airlines.
Right.
And while, we've talked about all the struggles that Boeing is facing as a whole, global services is actually thriving.
Really?
Yeah, their revenue is up, their operating margins are consistently strong.
That's really interesting because it seems counterintuitive that like one part of Boeing would be doing so well.
Right.
When the rest of the company is facing these like really tough times.
Right.
So why is that?
Well, I think it reflects a larger trend that we're seeing in the aviation industry.
Okay.
Airlines are still recovering from the pandemic.
Right.
They're facing economic uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so they're much more likely to invest in keeping their existing planes flying longer.
Right.
Rather than going out and buying brand new aircraft.
So they're kind of like delaying those big capital expenditures.
Exactly.
And focusing on just keeping the current fleet in the air.
That's exactly right. And that's where global services comes in.
Right.
They're the ones who are providing those essential services
that
airlines need to keep their planes in the air.
So is there a world in which global services is kind of like a model for the rest of Boeing? I mean, can they take those same principles of efficiency and long-term support?
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think global services does benefit from the fact that it's not as capital intensive as, say, building a brand new airplane.
Right.
But I do think there's a lesson here about diversifying revenue streams and building resilience.
Okay.
In times of, turbulence.
Yeah. For sure. And speaking of turbulence, I think we have to talk about the leadership change at Boeing. They've got a new CEO, Kelly Ortberg.
Right.
And he's making some pretty big promises about changing the culture at Boeing.
Yeah, this is going to be a critical development to watch.
Yeah.
You think about the context here, right?
Yeah.
Ortberg's stepping into the cockpit.
Right.
After the 737 MAX tragedies, the pandemic's impact on air travel, the production issues,
It's a lot.
the recent strike, he's got his work cut out for him.
Yeah.
But he has said that, his priority is to fundamentally change the culture at Boeing.
Okay.
To return it to, he said, an iconic company, an aerospace leader once again.
Those are big words.
They're big words.
But what does it actually take to change a company's culture?
Right.
Especially one as like large
Yeah.
and as complex as Boeing.
Yeah, it's a monumental task. There's no quick fix to this.
Right.
I think it requires a deep and honest look at what went wrong.
Yeah.
It's about more than just words.
Right.
It requires tangible actions.
Right.
And a sustained commitment from leadership at all levels.
Right. So it's not enough to just talk the talk.
Yeah.
You've got to walk the walk as well.
Exactly.
How long does something like that even take? I mean, are we talking months, years? Like, what's the realistic timeline for a cultural transformation like that?
Realistically, you're looking at years, not months.
Okay.
I mean, changing a company's DNA, especially when you're talking about a company the size of Boeing.
Right.
It's about shifting mindsets. It's about rebuilding trust.
Right.
It's about demonstrating a genuine commitment to doing things differently.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. Creating a culture of accountability, transparency, a relentless focus on quality and safety. That's what it's going to take.
Okay, so we've got the strikes, we've got these charges, we've got a new CEO who's trying to steer the ship in like a different direction.
Right.
But there's one other piece of the puzzle that we haven't talked about yet, which is this massive backlog of orders that Boeing is sitting on. I mean, we're talking over $511 billion worth of potential revenue.
Right. And that's the interesting, I think, counterpoint to a lot of the negative news that we saw in this quarter.
Okay.
That backlog represents a huge amount of potential future revenue for Boeing.
Yeah.
It shows that there's still strong demand for their products, especially in the commercial airplane market.
So the demand is there. The question is, can Boeing actually deliver? Can they take this backlog and actually turn it into revenue?
Right. And more importantly, profit.
It's like they've got the winning lottery ticket, but they can't find it.
Right.
I mean, they've got this incredible opportunity, but can they actually capitalize on it?
Yeah, that's the multi-billion-dollar question. And of course, the answer is complicated.
Right.
There's a few things that need to happen, I think, in order for Boeing to take those orders and turn them into actual cash.
Okay.
First and foremost, they got to get their production back on track.
Right.
We talked about the supply chain issues, the labor shortages, these lingering quality control problems. Until Boeing can actually churn out aircraft reliably and at the rate that they need to,
right,
that backlog is really just a number on a spreadsheet.
Right. It's like they've got this restaurant with a line of hungry customers out the door, but not enough cooks in the kitchen.
Exactly.
What else?
Well, the second thing is they've got to regain the trust of their customers, of the regulators.
Right.
The 737 MAX crisis really, I think, was a major blow to their reputation.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to rebuild that trust.
Sure.
If airlines are hesitant to take delivery of new planes because they're worried about safety,
right,
or they're worried about potential regulatory hurdles, then that backlog isn't going to be worth very much.
So they've got to prove to everyone that they've learned from their mistakes.
Absolutely.
And that safety is the #1 priority.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, you can't forget about the global economy.
Right.
I mean, Boeing operates in a cyclical industry that's very sensitive to economic ups and downs.
For sure.
So if we were to enter a global recession, airlines might be forced to delay or cancel orders,
right,
no matter how good Boeing's planes are.
So it's almost like they're trying to fly a plane through a storm.
Right.
And the plane is full of potential, but the weather's unpredictable.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to get the engines fired up.
That's a great way to put it.
So, I mean, it's a really, I think, fascinating picture of a company that's kind of at a crossroads.
They are, yeah.
They're dealing with some very real problems, but they've also got these really big opportunities.
Absolutely.
So for those of us listening at home, keep an eye on production.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on the safety improvements and just, keep an eye on the global economy.
Absolutely.
Because those are the things that are going to determine whether Boeing sinks or swims.
I think that's exactly right.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, really interesting.
Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.